December 17, 1944, 5:30, Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger's engine rattled, coughed once more, and went silent. SS Commander Joachim Peiper struck the turret hatch in frustration, the sharp ring cutting through the darkness before dawn. Below him, his driver tried again to wake the Maybach, 700 horsepower of German engineering. But the starter gave nothing back. The needle on the gauge sat at empty. From inside the hull came a tense report. The reserve tank was dry too. Peiper dropped down from his command vehicle, boots biting into frozen Belgian earth. All around him, the armored tip of Germany's thrust for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, was stalled in place. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 Waffen-SS troops, an elite formation immobilized not by enemy fire, but by fuel starvation. Through thin morning mist, Peiper could make out the American position ahead. Honsfeld, a key supply point for the US 99th Infantry Division. The withdrawal had been so hurried that oil drum fires still burned, coffee still steamed in metal cups, and in neat rows stood what looked like a miracle. Thousands of olive-drab jerry cans, American fuel containers lined up like a battlefield offering. Peiper moved toward them slowly, almost with ceremony. His adjutant, Hans Krüller, cracked one open and smelled the sharp bite of high-octane gasoline. Then the work began. Urgent, methodical, desperate, as men rushed to pour American fuel into German machines. Peiper paced the stockpile, calculating as he went. The figures were staggering. Roughly 50,000 gallons, enough to refill his entire combat group and keep the drive toward the Meuse alive. Enough, perhaps, to bend the offensive back into motion. In that single depot, the Americans had left behind more fuel than many German divisions had received in half a year. Yet, standing amid this windfall, watching German tanks drink from American reserves, a heavier truth settled in. If the United States could abandon such quantities, leave behind what Germany would have defended with whole formations, then the outcome was already decided. This was more than a mistake in planning. Germany had failed to grasp what kind of opponent it was fighting. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, that reality had already been written in numbers. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented a report that should have ended any thought of major offensives. Germany's synthetic fuel system, the Wehrmacht's bloodstream, was being dismantled by Allied bombing. The Leuna works, which had produced 175,000 tons in April, managed only 5,000 tons by September. Hydrogenation plants at Pörlitz, Blehammer and Bruchs were running at under 10% capacity. The math pointed to defeat with cold precision. In 1944, the United States produced about 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even counting synthetic output and captured Romanian sources, produced only about 33 million barrels, under 2% of the American total. The Third Reich was trying to fight a mechanized war, while its logistics collapsed back toward a horse-drawn reality. While the United States was fueling its armies with almost limitless petroleum, Major Friedrich Zimmermann of the Wehrmacht's logistics staff ran the numbers and found that the Ardennes operation would need about 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler authorized 5 million. but transport failures meant only roughly half actually arrived. From the start, Germany was staking everything on seizing enemy stocks, a plan that signaled desperation, not confidence. The Americans, by contrast, had built an entire fuel and supply machine in France, the PLUTO pipeline network and the Red Ball Express, a vast trucking system pushing roughly 12,500 tons of supplies a day to the front. By December 1944, US forces in Europe were burning around 1.2 million gallons of fuel daily and receiving about 1.4 million. They were building reserves even as they fought. Joachim Peiper understood exactly what that meant. At 29, he was among the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, a decorated Knight's Cross holder with oak leaves and swords, and a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he'd learned that, in modern war, fuel could matter more than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been chosen as the Schwerpunkt, the decisive spear point of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, Peiper sat through the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, put it plainly. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if you capture American supplies. For Kampfgruppe Peiper, the planned issue was about 31,000 gallons, enough for roughly 50 miles of combat movement. The Meuse was about 65 miles away. The shortfall wasn't accidental. It was built into the plan. As the column readied itself on December 16th, Peiper laid down strict fuel discipline. Tanks would move in single file to reduce waste. Engines were to be shut down for any stop longer than 5 minutes. And capturing American fuel dumps became priority 1, even above tactical targets. The difference between the two armies could not have been clearer. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, positioned barely 20 miles from Peiper's start line, noted in his unit diary, "Fuel resupply received, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage already full." December 16th, 1940, 5:30. The opening artillery barrage of Operation Watch on the Rhine burned through more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had once budgeted for entire operations earlier in the war. But the spectacle concealed the underlying strain. Peiper's column rolled out at 0700, already behind schedule. Roads that looked like major routes on German maps were in reality narrow rural lanes, many little more than dirt. Within hours, bottlenecks formed as vehicles built for the wide spaces of the Eastern Front choked in the forests and bends of the Ardennes. At Lanzarat, his first objective, Peiper ran into resistance he hadn't expected. A lone American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men who delayed the strongest armoured column Germany could field for nearly 10 hours. And every minute of that delay cost fuel. Engines idled. Tanks burned precious gallons while standing still. By the time they finally pushed through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper had advanced only 20 miles and spent about 40% of his fuel. At that pace, they would be out of fuel before they even reached the midpoint to the Meuse. And the American site at Honsfeld wasn't even a major hub. It was a forward refueling point for the 99th Infantry Division, what the U.S. Army classified as a temporary Class 3B fuel dump. Yet what Peiper found there amounted to more than a full month's fuel allotment for an entire German panzer division. Hans Krüller later described the scene in testimony. Mountains of jerry cans, each holding 5 gallons, piled into 3-meter stacks and stretching for roughly 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even tried to destroy them. The fuel itself was high grade, aviation gasoline blended with motor fuel, 80 octane or better. That quality created its own problem. German vehicles, especially the finicky Maybach engines in Tiger tanks, were built to run on lower grade, around 74 octane fuel. The American gasoline was, in effect, too refined, and several engines began to misbehave under it. And, as Peiper's men refueled, they uncovered more evidence of what they were really up against. In the depot office, Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping documents. Hoffmann could read English. He'd worked in his father's import business before the war. The paperwork traced the fuel's path, from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the Channel to Normandy, and then, by truck, some 400 miles to Honsfeld. More than 6,000 miles of movement, completed in under 6 weeks. In a 1976 interview, Hoffmann recalled showing the papers to Peiper. Peiper read them twice, crushed them in his hand and said nothing, but his face drained of colour. The implication was unmistakable. Then came another find. Private Ernst Kara uncovered a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, only 2 days old. The headline announced a newly opened fuel pipeline running from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single line pushing more fuel each day than Kampfgruppe Peiper expected to consume across the entire operation. To understand the impact of that moment, you have to see Germany's fuel reality by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had slashed synthetic fuel output by about 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation gasoline. Pilot training hours had been cut from roughly 250 to 60. The surface fleet of the German Navy had effectively stopped operating. U-boats were fitted with snorkels to save diesel, staying on batteries longer to reduce engine use. At home, private car traffic had virtually vanished since 1942. Fuel was so scarce that the Gestapo pursued black market theft measured in single litres. Farmers were turning back to horse-drawn ploughs. And across the ocean, the United States was producing the majority of the world's oil. The East Texas fields alone yielded more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were running so hard that Standard Oil was testing new petroleum derivatives simply because there was crude to spare. With roughly 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld, Peiper's spearhead lurched forward again. By noon on December 17th, they reached Büllingen, taking additional stores, rations, ammunition, and, most importantly, maps identifying other American fuel dumps scattered through the area. But those maps exposed something far worse than a shortage. The Americans had fuel everywhere. Depots sat at nearly every key crossroads, and the U.S. First Army alone held roughly 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper drove on toward Ligneville, where his unit would carry out the Malmedy massacre, murdering 84 American prisoners. Even that crime, in later accounts, was tied to the same pressure. Peiper would claim he couldn't spare the gasoline needed to move captives to the rear. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, the location of a major American fuel dump holding more than 2 million gallons. It was the prize that could have guaranteed his dash to the Meuse. But as the first German vehicles closed in, American engineers were already moving. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been warned of the approach. His directive was blunt: deny the fuel to the enemy at any cost. The Stavelot depot held 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in jerry cans spread across 15 acres. At 16:30 on December 17th, with Peiper's advance guard nearing the site, Brewster gave the signal. Engineers laid trails of gasoline between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were handed out. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first one. The blast, he later said, was instant and enormous. A column of fire surging upward nearly 100 feet. Within minutes, the entire depot became a single roaring furnace. When Peiper's lead tanks arrived, they found a towering column of black smoke climbing 1,000 feet into the sky. The flames would burn for 3 days, devouring enough fuel to have carried Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. One witness, Unterscharführer Weber, described what followed. The commander stood on the turret, staring into the blaze in silence for several minutes. Then he climbed down and spoke, stunned by the implication. They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us. What are we doing here? And Stavelot wasn't an exception. It was a pattern. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were torching fuel dumps rather than let them fall intact. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons went up. At Spa, another 2.5 million was destroyed. In the first week alone, the Americans deliberately burned more than 8 million gallons, more than Germany had set aside for the entire operation. That capacity to destroy fuel on that scale came from a logistics system the Germans simply couldn't match. The Red Ball Express had moved 412,000 tons of supplies using about 6,000 trucks running around the clock. Each truck burned roughly 40 gallons a day, and the fuel consumed by the supply operation itself exceeded what German Army Group B received in a typical month. By December 1944, the American Motor Transport Service fielded roughly 230 truck companies running on color-coded routes. The network was delivering about 20,000 tons of supplies a day, including around 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, the First Army's chief logistics officer, wrote on December 18, "Fuel received yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000. Net increase to reserves, 224,000 gallons." And the pipelines made the picture even more overwhelming. Operation PLUTO had pushed pipes under the English Channel, sending about 1 million gallons a day from Britain. Inland, pipeline lines extended the flow. The Cherbourg-Paris line moved roughly 800,000 gallons daily. Another system about 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe were using about 7.5 million gallons a day and receiving about 8.2 million. Even during offensive operations, they were still building stockpiles. So, as Peiper pressed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the brutal reality of Germany's situation sharpened with every mile. At Stoumont, they seized yet another cache, and then watched it vanish almost immediately. 5,000 gallons burned away in just 3 hours of fighting. Tiger tanks burned fuel at a brutal rate, roughly 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Panthers consumed about 1.5 gallons per mile. And in the broken, icy terrain of the Ardennes, usage climbed by another 40%. Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, noted the balance sheet with grim clarity. By noon on December 18th, they had spent about 67,000 gallons since the attack began, while capturing perhaps 55,000. They were moving forward in deficit. American intelligence, reading German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, understood exactly what was happening. General Courtney Hodges sent a direct instruction to his units. The enemy is critically short of fuel. Destroy any gasoline stocks that might be captured. That same day, American C-47 transport planes flew 316 supply sorties into Bastogne, delivering essentials, including roughly 160,000 gallons of fuel. The United States was airlifting more gasoline to a surrounded garrison than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. By December 19, as Peiper's forces fought around Stoumont, the crisis was no longer looming. It was immediate. Tanks were being abandoned, not because they were knocked out, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Peiper gathered what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one hard action or a retreat, but not both. And while he was scraping together gallons, Allied planners were calmly preparing January operations. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland asked for 245 million gallons for the coming month, and the request was approved without debate. The contrast wasn't only about volume. American equipment was designed around standardization and efficiency. A Sherman tank used roughly 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks could haul full loads while still making about 8 miles per gallon. Parts were interchangeable. Maintenance was streamlined. German formations, meanwhile, ran a chaotic mix of vehicles, domestic models and captured machines, each with its own fuel, oil, and spare part demands. French tanks required different lubricants than Panthers. Soviet trucks needed different components than German Opels. Every variation multiplied the logistical nightmare. On December 20th, Peiper received a blunt radio message. The fuel convoy had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply was possible. Continue with what you have. He brought his commanders together. Standartenführer Werner Pötschke spoke plainly. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. And according to Hans Krüler's testimony, Peiper summed up the lesson they'd been forced to learn. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to burn more fuel just to deny it than Germany had been given for the entire operation. What had seemed like a miracle at Honsfeld was, to the Americans, a minor loss. And in that moment, he admitted the conclusion. This could not be won. That understanding was spreading upward through the chain of command. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote that when he learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, he knew the offensive had failed before it truly began. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, captured on December 23rd, told his interrogators that American soldiers threw away chocolate while his men hadn't seen it in 2 years. Americans burned fuel by the million gallons while Germans counted it in liters. How, he asked, can anyone fight against such abundance? By December 21st, Peiper was encircled near La Glaise, his armor stuck in place. The American units closing in, the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored, together had a fuel allocation of roughly 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons left. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home that they had Germans surrounded who'd simply run out of gas, and that their captain joked they used more fuel heating coffee than the Germans had left for tanks. The American response showed industrial war at full power. Patton's Third Army, pivot north, required about 350,000 gallons just to redeploy, a movement German planners would have considered impossible. Yet it was executed in 3 days. Then came December 23rd, when the weather cleared. Allied air power returned in force, around 2,000 sorties flown in a single day, each aircraft consuming fuel at rates that would have kept the Luftwaffe grounded for weeks. P-47s burned roughly 300 gallons an hour. B-26s used about 200 gallons an hour. 1 day of air operations consumed more fuel than Germany had allotted for the entire offensive. On the night of December 23rd into December 24th, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had started the offensive, 39 were still mechanically operational, but immobilized, trapped by empty tanks. They were destroyed with their remaining ammunition rather than left intact. Oberreiter Heinz Grolz described what remained in the end. They siphoned the last fuel from every vehicle, perhaps 200 gallons in total, and the commander himself destroyed his own command tank. Equipment worth millions of Reichsmarks was wiped out not by enemy shells, but by empty fuel lines. Of the roughly 5,000 men who started the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, only about 770 made it back. They had pushed forward about 60 miles, seized several depots, and in the process uncovered the real story of Allied logistics. Word of what Peiper had seen moved quickly through the German command structure. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports detailing the captured American supplies. His chief of staff later noted Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the numbers twice. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than surrendered. Then he said simply, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept what the figures implied. Speer later wrote that Hitler dismissed the numbers as propaganda, and when shown photographs of Stavelot burning, claimed it was Hollywood trickery. But the lower ranks didn't need persuasion. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife that the Americans destroyed more fuel in a day than Germany received in a month, that they drove tanks the way Germans marched, and that the war was already lost. The fuel crisis was not an isolated problem. It was a symptom of something larger. By 1944, the United States was producing roughly half of the world's manufacturing output. An aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship each day, a tank every 7 minutes. The petroleum figures alone were crushing. The United States at 1.8 billion barrels, the Soviet Union at 110 million, Germany, even counting synthetic production, at 33 million, and Japan at 2.6 million. Even combined, the Axis produced less than 2% of American petroleum. After 1942, every major German offensive was bounded by fuel. American offensives were underwritten by levels of supply German planners could barely imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded an incident on December 27th that revealed the scale of the gap. A logistics officer complained that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons a day. Concern spread, until someone pointed out that this reduced flow still exceeded Germany's entire fuel allotment for the Ardennes offensive. German prisoners from the Ardennes were often more shaken by American waste than by American firepower. Watching GIs toss half-eaten rations or burn gasoline for warmth did more to break morale than artillery. One prisoner told interrogators that they had known American production numbers in the abstract, but seeing soldiers casually squander more than the Germans possessed made those numbers real. Any German who witnessed that abundance, he said, understood the war was hopeless. Despite censorship, the realization spread through letters. One soldier wrote that Americans washed clothes in gasoline, fed chocolate to dogs, and fired artillery for Christmas, and that no one could fight against infinity. The psychological effect cut straight through the regime's narratives. How could decadent Americans possess such wealth while the supposed master race scavenged for basics? At Nuremberg, German leaders repeatedly pointed to logistics, especially fuel, as decisive. Field Marshal Keitel testified that Germany had enjoyed operational superiority in 1940 and 1941, but by 1944 could no longer move forces for lack of fuel, while the Americans shifted armies like pieces on a board. Peiper himself, addressing the aftermath and his decisions, testified that everything after December 17 was shaped by fuel scarcity. They could not maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. The Americans moved freely, while Germans counted liters. Heinz Guderian later wrote that when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, everything to him, almost nothing to the Americans, the war's outcome was already sealed. The story endures because it marks the moment industrial warfare reached its final logic. Victory belonged to production capacity, not romantic ideals of courage. In the Ardennes, among stalled tanks and dry fuel gauges, the old image of war died. Historian Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, the Allied to Axis production ratio exceeded 5-1 in major categories, and in petroleum it neared 50-1. No level of training or tactical brilliance could erase an advantage like that. The United States produced 324,750 aircraft during the war. Germany built about 119,970. America manufactured 88,410 tanks. Germany, 46,857. But the clearest measure of all was oil. In 1944 alone, the United States refined roughly 1.8 billion barrels, while Germany struggled to assemble about 33 million. December 24th, 1944. As Peiper's men slipped out on foot through American lines, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the scale of the imbalance finally snapped into focus. They had seized 50,000 gallons, a haul that felt like a miracle, only to learn it was trivial to an enemy who could burn fuel by the millions without hesitation. In a 1975 reflection, an Unterscharführer captured the mood. That morning at Honsfeld, finding American fuel felt like winning the lottery. By evening, hearing about Stavelot in flames, they understood the war was already lost. The Americans had so much, they could destroy what Germans would die to possess. Those 50,000 gallons, he noted, were less than what a single American armored division could consume in 2 days.
It was less than what the Red Ball Express could burn in just a few hours. A rounding error against Allied daily usage.
Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote that the German obsession with capturing fuel exposed a fatal assumption. They believed the Americans valued gasoline, as Germans did, as something scarce and irreplaceable. They could not grasp a supply system so deep that it could afford to torch millions simply to avoid tactical risk.
Operation Watch on the Rhine failed under the unbending mathematics of industrial war.
The offensive consumed roughly 2.8 million gallons, a large portion of what Germany had set aside, with the difference made up by whatever could be captured. During the same period, American forces consumed about 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But the most crushing loss was less visible: the collapse of belief. For every German who saw American abundance with his own eyes, it became clear that Germany was not fighting a winnable campaign. It was moving through the final stages of an inevitable outcome.
Joachim Peiper survived the war, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes.
On July 14, 1976, he was killed at his home in France by unknown attackers. But years earlier, in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman that discovering the fuel depot had been the worst moment of all. If they had run out earlier, they might have withdrawn with a sense of dignity. Instead, they learned the Americans had oceans while they had drops, and they discovered, face to face, what impossibility looked like.
The lesson goes beyond the Ardennes.
In industrial warfare, logistics outruns tactics. Production overwhelms courage. Abundance defeats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 might have been more hardened and more experienced, and it didn't change the outcome. He was backed by an economy that could not replace what it spent, facing an economy that could waste more than Germany could ever produce.
That truth was written into every jerrycan at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline stretched across France.
In wars between industrial powers, the decisive weapons are factories and refineries as much as generals. Colonel Trevor Dupuy later calculated that in December 1944, an American soldier was supported by roughly 67 pounds of supplies per day, while the German soldier received about 3. Americans complained about waste. Germans would have seen that waste as unimaginable wealth.
In 1984, 40 years after the battle,
veterans gathered at L'Aglaise. The museum displayed Peiper's Tiger tank, still sitting where it had run out of fuel. On December 23, 1944, former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann stood beside it with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. Anderson said they had always wondered why the Germans stopped. They assumed it was some tactical decision. Wortmann laughed bitterly. They stopped because the tanks were empty. The Americans burned millions just to keep it from them. How could anyone fight that?
Anderson fell silent, then admitted they never realized the Germans were that short.
The Americans had so much they didn't even think about it. That exchange distilled the truth of December 1944. One side counted by the gallon, the other by the million. One fought for each jerry can, the other could burn oceans. The outcome was already set.
German records themselves read like a verdict.
Army Group B's War Diary, December 1944. December 16th. The offensive begins. Fuel at 70% of the minimum. December 17th. Peiper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th. Multiple dumps destroyed, more than 5 million gallons lost. December 19th. Fuel critical, units immobilized. December 24th. Peiper abandons vehicles, fuel exhaustion. And at the same time, the US First Army reported on December 16th. Reserves, 3.7 million gallons.
December 17th, 2.2 million gallons destroyed.
December 18th, 1.8 million received. December 24th, reserves at 4.1 million. The Americans treated fuel measured in millions as routine. The Germans treated fuel as something counted can by can.
And the gap wasn't only in volume. American gasoline also reflected a technological edge. US refineries had mastered catalytic cracking, producing higher octane fuel more efficiently than Germany's hydrogenation process. American 100-octane aviation gasoline gave real performance advantages over aircraft running on 87-octane synthetic blends. The Americans also had additives Germany could not match: tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, detergent compounds, refinements that improved power and reliability. German engines, tuned for lower-grade fuel, sometimes ran poorly even when they managed to capture American gasoline. The shortage shaped daily life at every level. Gefreiter Hans Müller wrote on December 20th that they marched 30 kilometers because there was no fuel for trucks. Along the route, they passed abandoned American vehicles left with engines idling for warmth. They leave engines running, he noted, while German soldiers trudged through snow on foot. Medical services broke down in the same way.
Ambulances could not evacuate the wounded. Field hospitals could not reliably run generators. Men died waiting for transport that never arrived. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting later testified that they had capable surgeons and even medical supplies captured from the Americans, but no fuel for ambulances. Soldiers who might have lived, he said, died simply because they could not be moved even 10 kilometers.
What the troops saw also shattered the propaganda they'd been fed.
They had been told the Americans were soft, weak, incapable of sustained effort. And then they watched the Americans burn more fuel than Germany possessed. Goebbels noted the consequences in his diary on December 28th. Reports of serious morale problems, letters describing American superiority, a narrative slipping out of the regime's control. Censorship could not stop stories that soldiers had lived firsthand. The myth of German superiority could not survive direct contact with American logistics.
With the Ardennes offensive failed, Germany was left with little besides desperate defense.
General Jodl later testified at Nuremberg that after the Ardennes, they understood it was lost. They had played their last card, only to discover the enemy held all the aces. Recognizing that desperation, the Allies intensified attacks on German fuel production. By February 1945, German output had effectively collapsed. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Training was curtailed. The Wehrmacht became increasingly static, and then was destroyed piece by enemies who could still maneuver. By spring 1945, the war produced scenes that felt unreal. German units surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could not move. Whole panzer formations sat helpless as Allied columns drove past. Generalmajor Fritz Bäuerlein described the logic. They had 42 operational tanks, trained crews, ammunition, and only about 300 litres of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. They destroyed their own vehicles and walked into captivity. Meanwhile, the American advance was limited less by shortages than by overcrowding. Traffic jams created by sheer abundance. Patton's Third Army alone fielded around 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis is a compressed illustration of how industrial capacity decided the war. When Peiper stood among those captured jerrycans that December morning, he was looking at the truth in physical form. Germany was fighting an opponent whose waste exceeded German necessity. The arithmetic did the rest. Germany's offensive fuel allotment, 5 million gallons. Fuel deliberately destroyed by the Americans, 8 million. Daily American consumption, about 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's miracle at Honsfeld, 50,000 gallons, roughly 0.6% of what the Americans used in a single day. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States around 19,000 dead, and Germany perhaps 100,000. It burned through the Wehrmacht's last reserves. But its most enduring effect inside the German army was psychological. It spread a simple, crushing understanding through the ranks. America possessed an abundance that defied German comprehension. And Peiper's discovery wasn't merely about fuel. It was a glimpse into the rules of industrial warfare itself, where victory goes to the side that can manufacture petroleum, steel, aluminum, and the systems to move them. In that contest, Germany was outmatched from the start. The final irony arrived after the fighting, when American teams catalogued the abandoned German vehicles at La Glaise and found 39 tanks left behind in near-perfect condition, abandoned solely because their fuel tanks were empty. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report recorded the solution with bureaucratic calm. Fuel required, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time, 4 hours. What had been impossible for the Germans, finding enough gasoline to save their best armor, was, to the Americans, a minor request answered from nearby stock. That was the real meaning of Honsfeld. Not simply that the United States had more fuel, but that American abundance existed on a scale where German scarcity barely registered. In that sense, the war's outcome was set the moment American industry fully mobilized. Honsfeld only made visible what had been true since 1942. Germany was fighting the impossible, measuring defeat in gallons, while America measured victory in oceans. Today, the Tiger tank sits in the museum at La Glaise, its fuel gauge fixed at empty. A monument to the moment tactical excellence collided with logistical reality and lost. Visitors look at the steel and ask why such machines were abandoned. The answer is as plain as it is decisive. No fuel.